They listened, but is it enough? In the last couple of days, we have received the new 8 hero talent trees for a bunch new classes and specs with some very interesting changes and some additions, but still some issues might still be there. However, they have even responded within less than 24 hours regarding some of the core concerns that people have had about the new talent trees. Is this a good sign for the war within? Of course it is, you dummy, but there's more! Now, whether you read your daily Wowhead articles or not, you should be subscribed. It's a very good source of information for World of Warcraft. You might know or not know that we have 8 new hero talent trees for 8 not always new classes. There's still some that still hasn't received anything, like Monk and Shaman. So yeah, we're still gonna wait on those for those classes. However, for the ones that we do have access to, let's start off with the Druid first. So Druid has received Elun's Chosen, which we kind of seen slightly before, and also Wild Stalker. Although I'm not going to go super in depth with everything because it's 8 talent trees with 10 nodes each, so that's 80 talent nodes. That's quite a bit. I mean, you can check the link down below and check them out for yourself if you'd like. But to give you a summary of what I believe as a player that has played all of these specs and even mains a bunch of them and has mained a bunch of them in the past, I have some concerns. First of all, with Elun's Chosen, that will be the hero talent tree between Balance and Guardian Druid, and it is going to be heavily focused on, you guessed it, arcane damage, which is not uncommon. Both Guardian and Balance do have arcane themes, well, Balance obviously, but Guardian as well has the Galactic Guardian, the Lunar Beam, and all of that stuff, and in Dragonflight, it has received a bunch of new arcane nodes that increases the arcane damage that you do, you heal per the arcane damage that you do, and so on and so forth, and most, if not all of them, are really focused for Bear, at the very least around Lunar Beam. Now, why am I focused on Bear that much? Well, because with Balance, I mean, you're going to have buffed up Fury of Eluns and New Moons. That's pretty much your core playstyle at the moment anyway. But Guardian doesn't really play Lunar Beam. Guardian never really played Lunar Beam. Guardian cannot really play Lunar Beam in the current iteration because no matter how much they buff it, it is very, very bad. So that's slightly concerning, but we can only assume that post these talents being released, they will address Lunar Beam as well, because otherwise, I don't know if Guardian will want to play Elun's Chosen, because you don't really want Lunar Beam, but at the same time, arcane damage for Bear has been one of the cornerstones of his Dragonflight design and capabilities of actually doing competitive damage. It's not DPS out DPSing any other tank anytime soon, but it does do enough to keep aggro, and that's really important. Moving to Wild Stalker Druid, that is Feral and Restoration themed hero talent. They, as you might have guessed or assumed going into this, really concern damage over time and heal over time, which is kind of the one thing that they have in common a lot. And it's overall okay. There are some boring nodes, some noteworthy nodes, but essentially you just have more dots and more HOTS. It's very early to tell exactly how good this is. There are still concerning questions as a Restoration Druid enjoyer as myself, that nothing really addresses rejuvenation in either of the Restoration talents, and that has also been confirmed by a recent blue post that Druids still Restoration, that is, have nothing for rejuvenation. So essentially there's been an update on the talent called Thriving Growth, the design for it, where the blue post says, and I quote, "The text of the Wild Stalker Thriving Growth talent is being updated to reflect the latest version of the design." And this is in the case that you read those talent tooltips for yourself as well. It should read, "Wild Growth, Regrowth, and Efflorescence have a chance to cause symbiotic blooms to grow on the target, and not rejuvenation." Now, this is of course a mixed bag of feelings, because part of the core identity of Restoration Druid is rejuvenation, and none of these hero talents seem to address it whatsoever. Now, I would be surprised if rejuvenation at any point in time will drop off of the radar for Restoration Druid, considering that right now it's the biggest source of throughput. Last I checked, about a week ago. I don't think that changed in 1 week, so it's probably still going to be good. It's definitely going to still be necessary, but the fact that there's no like real theme around it kind of sucks a little bit. However, there are some interesting designs in the utility part of these hero talent trees that I do have to point out, because these are the kind of things that kind of spur some excitement and hope for the future. And one such talent is Entangling Vortex, that you can pick as a choice node with Flower Walk. Yes, there's a talent called Flower Walk. Back to Entangling Vortex. Enemies pulled into Ursol's Vortex are rooted in place for 6 seconds. Damage may cancel the effect. Now, do you remember all those times when you combined Ursol's Vortex with Typhoon? Now add a round of roots on top of it all. That sounds freaking fantastic. I love the way they think when they come up with these certain talents. I just hope that this permeates through the rest of the talent tree. Overall, I don't have major feelings about Wild Stalker. In terms of restoration, we can probably put it side by side with Keeper of the Grove and kind of decide which one is better. If I had to choose, I would probably choose Wild Stalker because it just feels like it makes more sense for Restoration Druid, considering that Restoration Druid will also get buffs to its cat form abilities, aka cat weaving, and that has always been, you know, the preferred way of Restoration Druid doing damage in dungeons and in raids, and it is currently the best way to deal damage in dungeons and in raids. So having that buffed is even better as opposed to Keeper of the Grove, where you're forced into trance and they essentially cast Moonfires every now and again. That's for Druid. Now we move on to Evoker, Scale Commander, and if you have paid attention to the Abyss raid and to the story into the Warlock Cavern, you might guess that Scale Commander is for Augmentation and Devastation. As a non-fan of Evoker myself, I do have to say that this is one of the biggest surprises that I have seen so far in its current design, and it actually addresses things that you would want to have in these two specs, particularly Devastation, since I did play Devastation more than Augmentation, and I'm talking about the cornerstone of the Scale Commander hero talent, which is Mass Eruption / Mass Disintegrate. Yes, Mass Disintegrate is something that Devastation will have, and it will probably add an extra Death of Layer to its AoE, where Mass Devastation can only hit 3 targets, if I'm not mistaken, up to 3 targets. I don't know if it scales 3 on top of the original one. These talent tooltips seem to change a little bit from week to week, so for now all we know is that it just does AoE damage. And some of the more interesting talents here, which I am all for, and this is the kind of stuff that ideally we should have had baseline, but we'll settle for hero talents at the moment, affect Deep Breath and Breath of Eons. Breath of Eons, we know it's for augmentation where you buff everybody, and that's fine, but Deep Breath is kind of like the iconic ability for Evoker if you don't want to count Fire Breath. Deep Breath is essentially where you just travel along and just deal mega damage to everybody, potentially stun them if you have the talent, and you end up at the end and you just do your dragony stuff. This is probably the most dragony thing you can do. And I guess the capstone of the Scale Commander talent tree is called Maneuverability. Going back to what I said about Wild Stalker Druid, some unique mechanics and utility that they can add to make WoW have a more modern combat is definitely appreciated, and this is also one of them. What Maneuverability does is Deep Breath and Breath of Eons can now be steered in your desired direction. In addition, Deep Breath and Breath of Eons burn targets for volcanic damage over 12 seconds, and through the talent tree, the hero talent tree that is, you have ways to reduce the cooldown of Deep Breath. What this means is that you essentially go into Deep Breath and you just move around and you hit everything without you having just an AoE and just having to wait for the animation to finish without any type of dynamic input from you to choose a direction. This is really cool. Obviously, it doesn't really add any real bonus damage to it unless you assume that the targets are just all over the place and you're just deep breathing left and right and zigzaggy to get all of them. But you also have the volcanic dot at the end, which works in conjunction with the rest of the hero talents, which you can check of course for yourself. But the fact that they added a way to direct the deep breath mechanic is fantastic, and I love it. I hope they keep doing mechanical things like that for other classes, because not everybody is so lucky. And with this iteration, Paladin has gotten its final 2 trees, and it is the first class that has all of the hero talents revealed. Herald of the Sun is essentially the Holy and Retribution combination of the talents that focuses around sunspots, which is a debuff / buff that you can either use on your friends or your enemies because it's tied to Word of Glory. The overall playstyle of the sunspots is one of the hardest to actually judge because it introduces a bunch of mechanics where you interact with both your enemies and your parties in kind of like a similar way, but adds a layer of depth and complexity to the spec that you will definitely want to keep min-maxing, optimizing, playing around. So Because all of these numbers are temporary until we have access to the alpha so we can test them out, we don't really know exactly what's going on. But the sheer fact that the capstone called Sun's Avatar is saying during Avenging Wrath, you become linked with your sunspots, causing radiant damage to enemies or healing to allies that pass through the beams, reduced beyond 5 targets. And when I think about this, I think about the Hell Chains from Unholy Death Knight that kind of creates the link between you and your pet. That used to do really big damage when it was introduced, and you still never really played around it where you just like moved around through the packs or boss to get the targets hit by your beam. So I don't know if this will change with Sun's Avatar, but activating Avenging Wrath applies 4 sunspots onto nearby allies or enemies and increases sunspot damage and healing by 20%. Numbers are just numbers at the end of the day. I do have questions a lot concerning specifically Ret when it comes to activating Avenging Wrath. Now, if you're fighting a boss, do you put a sunspot, like an offensive sunspot on the enemy and then the rest on your allies? Because the more you go into this particular hero talent tree, the sunspots essentially sound like another version of glimmers with more mechanics tied to them. Essentially, you can have them both on friendlies and on allies, and they do their respective thing if they're on allies or if they're on enemies, not friendlies. Jeez. So there's still a bunch of questions here. However, probably the most exciting one that I have personally seen so far has to be the Templar hero talent tree, where protection and retribution have a new ability called Light's Guidance, which makes one of their core abilities, Eye of Tyr for protection and Wake of Ashes for retribution, transform into a different ability after they've been used, and that ability is Hammer of Light. This is very akin to how Red has Templar Strikes as a new talent, where it's a combo ability that changes into something else once you have used it. Most likely after you use Wake of Ashes and Eye of Tyr respectively, they go on their respective cooldown, and then you have the Hammer of Light mechanic, which we can only guess because we only have the theory of it. It's a big ass hammer that just slaps your targets and does a whole bunch of stuff. It is a consumer, so it consumes 5 holy power. Now, there is a pretty obvious concern with Protection Paladin when you give a tank another spender for its only resource that creates mitigation and survivability. That always has to be juggled in a way, so that's a very thin line to walk on and provide the balance for. But overall, the entire theme of the hero talent tree is just hammers for everybody, hammers falling from the sky, hammers falling from yourself. I don't even know where all these hammers have been all my life, but I want this right now. I can probably put my finger on Trickster Rogue and say with a fair degree of confidence that it is the Oracle version of this particular round of hero talent, where it has a very questionable implementation in its design. The actual core mechanic is called Unseen Blade, and what this does is feint your defensive cooldown, now grants 2 combo points and quickly slashes with an unseen blade, dealing damage to nearby enemies. Targets struck are phased for 5 seconds, and phased enemies take 5% more damage from you and cannot parry your attacks. Just to quickly go over what the overall idea of this is to play into the phase mechanic, where you deal more damage to phase targets and you proc phase first of all with feint, of course, but with some other abilities as well. You are also tied into Killing Spree as Outlaw and Secret Technique as Subtlety. Now, Subtlety really loves Secret Technique, and Outlaw really hates Killing Spree. Killing Spree is one of the coolest things Outlaw does, but I cannot deny the fact that it is a very antiquated way of dealing damage. It is essentially an ability that lasts for a couple of seconds that locks you into a specific animation. It breaks you away from your rotation for a spec that wants to have consistent uptime on your globals and not have to spend 2-3 seconds or however long Killing Spree will last doing nothing and waiting for the animation to finish, on top of everything else that Killing Spree means. Now, being forced into specific talents is still an ongoing issue, and we have a video ready on it soon, so stay tuned on our channel. But feint is the biggest issue here. Currently, for all 3 rogue specs, feint is a defensive cooldown. It offers, I think, baseline 20% damage reduction from area of effect, and especially if you talent into elusiveness, it becomes a very strong defensive on a very short cooldown. Now, Outlaw might not care very much, considering that Restless Blades reduces the cooldown of feints, and you probably might have, especially with this hero talent tree, close to 100% uptime on feint. Subtlety definitely cares about it, because we already have Vanish for both of these specs that is kind of like a utility slash defensive ability that has to be used offensively, and rogues kind of have mixed opinions out of it. I am one of the players in the camp that doesn't really like to use Vanish offensively. It is a cool thing, but it is also a unique rogue thing that you use to kind of dodge mechanics, drop aggro, and do other stuff that only rogue can do, and it feels like that fantasy is being taken away from me and making me use it in an offensive manner, and now Feint will also do the same, because if Feint turns into an offensive cooldown, then as a regular World of Warcraft player that you are, you will always use it offensively in your rotation for optimizing your damage, so hence your survivability can become a liability. I might be overreacting a little bit, because although Feint is very good, it won't kill you not to have it unless you're doing very high Mythic Plus keys or pushing progress rate on Mythic rating. Because that's when 20% damage reduction consistently on certain mechanics, stuff like the Iridicron mechanic that you have to soak, you have Feint for pretty much all of them, you have Feint to rotate during heavy intake of damage, whenever automatic or mandatory damage happens. That is what Feint usually covers, and is one of the biggest reasons why Rogue is one of the tankiest classes in the game. Putting that into an offensive cooldown, not ideal, I have to say. And if you think otherwise, let us know in the comment section down below. I, as a main rogue, am not very keen about it, so hopefully they listen to this and maybe they address this, because overall the trickster fantasy, and you can check the talent tree below, is one of the coolest ones and has some of the most roguey things I have seen, and I had my doubts when I was looking at the hero talents for rogue, and this has cleared a lot of them, with the exception of Feint. Warlock has gotten its first talent tree as well, Diabolist, which is demonology and destruction. This, once again, is a really cool theme, and initially sparked a lot of questions when it came out, but it has been clarified as well. First of all, the whole tree revolves around Diabolic Ritual, which means spending a soul shard grants Diabolic Ritual for 20 seconds, which is a buff, does nothing so far. While Diabolic Ritual is active, however, each soul shard spent reduces its duration by 1 second. When Diabolic Ritual expires, you gain Demonic Art, causing your next ability that costs soul shards, so your next spender, to summon an Overlord, Mother of Chaos, or Pit Lord that unleashes a devastating attack against your enemies. Now, Destruction Warlocks might be accurately concerned about them getting an extra pet, because they don't like pet. That's usually one of the reasons why you play Destruction. However, as far as we know, and we don't really know that much either, we can only assume that since Pitlord is also introduced here, it kind of works similarly to Nether Portal, where the demons just do their own thing. You can kind of think of them as dots. They just do their damage. You can see them, but you cannot really interact with them or command them in any way, shape, or form. Now, the main concern was that these three demons are subsequently buffed throughout the hero talent tree to do different cool things. For instance, the Overlord is seen in the next talent called Cloven Souls. Enemies damaged by your Overlord have their souls cloven. Cloven? I don't know. I'm not an English speaker. It is what it is. Increasing damage taken by you and your pets by 10% for 20 seconds. That is a lot of damage increase for a very large amount of time, which is a damage window, which means you're going to have to play around it, ideally. So there's extra plates to spin on your Warlock. Probably more impactful and more interesting to deal with as Destruction, since Demo already has a bunch of stuff that you have to do. So having one more might be a little bit... But that aside, the next one is obviously Secrets of the Coven. Mother of Chaos empowers your next Shadow Bolt or Incinerate to become Demon Fire Barrage. This is really cool. Demon Fire Barrage is a channel of a 1.5 seconds of 4 Shadow Bolts at 150% effectiveness towards the enemy target over 1.5 seconds. Now, we can only assume that these Shadow Bolts turn into Incinerates if you are in Destruction spec. Essentially means this is 4 Soul Shards almost instantly as Demonology and 4 Soul Fragments as Destruction, potentially having some neat implications with Fire and Brimstone style talents, where your Incinerate just either cleaves or generates more Soul Shards or things like that, which is kind of interesting for Destruction, but we haven't really seen much of it so far. But that is obviously a cool concept, and that's really great when Mother of Chaos comes out. And the capstone is your actual Pit Lord, which is called Ruination. When summoning your Pit Lord causes your next Hand of Gul'dan or Chaos Bolt to become Ruination. And that means that they will call down a demon-infested meteor from the depths of a twisting nether, dealing chaos damage on impact to all enemies within 8 yards of the target and summoning 3 wild imps. Now, first of all, to get the major worry out of the way, the whole diabolic ritual is on a cycle. The demons are not random, because that was probably the main concern that I had, and probably other people as well, that if it's 2 RNG, you might want one demon, you might want another. The fact that you cycle them through, it kind of depends on how fast you get to cycle them, because then some parts of the talent tree just become inactive because you just have the other demons and not the one that you really want, or the one that you would really need. But it also adds a predictable thing to it. Think of it as survival hunter wildfire bombs, but actually no RNG, so you know which one is coming up. This could add some interesting gameplay implications, where you might have to alter or prep your rotation in a certain way to benefit the most out of the demon that's coming out. Now, if that's too impactful, I can understand that might cause some friction, because Warlock is already pretty restrictive in terms of how it's doing its rotation, where it can be very subject to mechanics and having to break its cast, and we know the Warlock struggles, but at least it's not RNG. Now, the other question here, especially with the Ruination, is wild imps. Why does this show get wild imps? I understand that these could have very big benefits for demonology. At the very least, you can implode them and do a lot of damage. You can, of course, use them to empower your demonic turn, or have them empowered by demonic turn, but that's already capped at what? I think it's 15 imps now, and usually if you play a heavy imp build on demonology, you have 20-30 imps usually out at a time, so I don't know how much that will matter. I can only really see a big value in implosion, but obviously that could change in War Within. We don't know how the builds will shake up. We don't know if the talents will be changing anyway. But for destruction, I have no idea what the wild imps will do. Are they just passive sources of fell bolts and that's it? That is kind of boring, I gotta say. And last but not least, another favorite, the Warrior Colossus, where you're currently sitting at 2 hero talents already revealed, with 1 still left. The Colossus is arms and protection available, and it features around Revenge, Shield Slam, Mortal Strike, and it has a new ability called Demolish, which is what it starts with. This is a 45-second cooldown ability, and it unleashes a series of precise and powerful strikes against your target and enemies within 8 yards of it. You can block, parry, and dodge while using this ability, probably to address the protection warrior situation, where we've had channel abilities in the past, and being able to still mitigate damage through it is very, very important. Now, there are a lot of questions. How is this a channeled ability? Is it like the Legion artifact shield flame thing, where you just have to sit still and let the shield breathe fire? Or is it like Rampage for Fury, where you just activate it and it does a 1-2 second animation of just doing a bunch of hits, while during which time you can probably maybe squeeze in another global or something like that? We don't know yet, and it goes double into the worry territory when you look at the capstone. So we're gonna swap around a little bit, which is Unstoppable Force. Weirdly, there's already a talent in the class tree for Warrior called Unstoppable Force, especially for protection. And to explain what this does, firstly we need to take a look at another talent called Colossal Might, which is the debuff/buff that you'll be rolling and optimizing around with this hero talent. Mortal Strike and Shield Slam grant a stack of Colossal Might. Colossal Might increases the damage dealt by Demolish by 10% and stacks up to 5 times. Demolish consumes Colossal Might to deal the extra damage, and you generate and you play with the Colossal Might throughout the talent tree. Essentially, what Unstoppable Force does is Colossal Might now stacks 10 times, because otherwise you would over-generate the stacks, and if you would gain a stack of Colossal Might and are at max stacks, the cooldown of Demolish is reduced by 2 seconds. Now, 2 seconds doesn't really say much, but essentially what it means is that we will have faster and faster Demolishes, faster than 45 seconds. Protection already likes to play haste. I don't know if Arms likes crit haste now, so it's going to be a fast gameplay with fast Demolishes. The second part of this is what might cause some questions. While channeling Demolish, you are grounded, making you immune to stun effects and effects that move you. This is the problem, the real problem, because this is essentially Whirling Dragon Punch from Windwalker and I-Beam from Havoc Demon Hunters. Yes, those mechanic exists, and the sheer fact of being grounded and not being able to move is the only negative of these mechanics, because combat in World of Warcraft is very fast-paced. And the reason why this is a problem is because if you're stuck in an animation and you cannot move, you have a high chance of being hit by something you don't want to be hit, because you're not moving around to dodge it. That is one of the concerns. Now, with enough knowledge and experience and practice, you can probably play around this, and the amount of times that it will actually hit you for lethal damage will probably be very low. But the other question is, how long is the demolished channel? Because we still don't know. We can assume it's rampage level. That would be the safest assumption to make, but it can still be longer. We already learned from the Firlath legendary that having a static channel that's kind of intruding on your rotation, it feels kind of bad. So that really matters. Is it going to be a hasted channel where the more haste you have, the faster you get to channel it? That would add a nice flow to the gameplay, make it really, really interesting. Overall, the theme is really cool and the talents are nice. And even with this, there are a couple of other talents to mention. For instance, the choice node Bone Shaker or Earthquaker. Bone Shaker makes Shockwave stun duration increased by 2 seconds. That is giga good. That means Shockwave will be a 40 seconds, 4-second AoE stun duration. I think it will be the best AoE stun in the game, or AoE crowd control of any kind in the game. That is very, very good. The other thing is Earthquaker. Shockwave also knocks enemies into the air and its cooldown is reduced by 5 seconds, putting it down to 35. That raises questions because it also stuns. Is the knockback happening at the same time as the stun? Do those two crowd controls overlap, making one of them useless? I don't know exactly what that means. Is the knockback happening after the stun? Or is the knockback instead of the stun? Why would you want a knockback instead of the stun if that's the case? There's a bunch of stuff that haven't been answered, but probably the main issue is that Warrior doesn't really like to play Shockwave. You kind of really play it out of necessity in big Mythic Plus keys because you really might need an AoE stun and that's about it, which is probably why you should play this in the first place. But this is a capstone, and it takes away big damage from other capsules that you can have. And thankfully, Blizzard has responded with essentially them saying that the Shockwave will have a different position within the War Within. Their blog post essentially says the Warrior tree will be updated in the War Within to make the Shockwave talent more easily accessible via class talents. We wanted to call this out as the Colossus tree interacts with Shockwave in a few places. This is the main reason why we're having this video, because pretty much all of the hero talent trees so far, or the majority of them, forces you, the player, to select specific talents that you may or may not want. Whether you are okay with them being picked, like maybe Secret Technique for Subtlety Rogue or Feral Frenzy for Wildstalker Feral Druid, it doesn't really matter because it takes away a choice from you. And when it comes to maybe Diabolist Warlock, where you'll probably want Nether Portal, Tyrant, and Summon Grimoire, that's 3 spread out talents in your talent tree that's going to pretty much restrict a bunch of your talent build up as your Demonology Warlock. And hero talents are supposed to be fresh and add a new layer of fun and things. Now, I don't know how I feel about being forced into specific talents. All I know is that it might feel good for some specs, terrible for others. Giving up choices doesn't really feel good in an RPG, especially when it comes to building the character that you want to have, which is kind of the point of the hero talents, but in this case choosing one version of the hero talents or the other version of the hero talents. Having options taken away from the actual spec talent tree as well doesn't really feel good, so I hope that they keep this in mind and the talents that affect these hero talents in particular are moved to be either more accessible or maybe moved baseline so that there's less friction and doesn't force the player to give up way too many options to enjoy their spec. And to address this issue, we have a video coming out in a couple of days, but until then you gotta watch this one, because this one talks about why certain hero talents and certain design of the hero talents are not as Warcrafty and might cause some issues like Dragonflight had. Controversial one, it seems, so you might want to check it out.